This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to Mark O'Regan, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon, and to Tiffany Peng, who just increased her pledge amount. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 408 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing Season 1 of the CBS series Star Trek Picard. And this will involve spoilers for all 10 episodes, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, making her 17th appearance on the show. She's a Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in Connecticut with a Renaissance engineer, a dog, and a bird. She considers Star Trek to be her third and best parent. So Sara, welcome to the show.
Very excited to be here.
Then next up, we've got Daniel H. Wilson, making his 5th appearance on the show. He holds a PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University, and is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 novels, including Robopocalypse, The Clockwork Dynasty, and Guardian Angels and Other Monsters. His latest novel, The Andromeda Evolution, a sequel to Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain, is out now. So Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And also joining us today is Melinda Snodgrass, making her 4th appearance on the show. She's the author of over a dozen novels, and she's also written scripts for TV shows such as The Outer Limits and Sequest DSV. Her Star Trek The Next Generation script, The Measure of a Man, has been voted as one of the 10 best Star Trek scripts of all time. Together with George R.R. Martin, she edits the Wildcard series of shared world superhero anthologies, and she's currently serving as executive producer on the upcoming Wildcards TV show. So Melinda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so let's start off with Sara, and have you just tell us about what sort of expectations did you have going into this new Picard show?
Well, I had actually been at Star Trek Las Vegas when he made the announcement that they were doing this, and I was in my hotel room looking at Twitter while my partner was changing into a cosplay. And I was like, we have to get downstairs right now, and I, went downstairs, and of course by then he was gone, and Michael Dorn was actually milling around, and he was like, wow, that was amazing. Like, as soon as he left, like, all of the air just went out of the room. But, so I unfortunately didn't get a chance to see him then. But, yeah, I mean, I'm super excited, and I had no expectations, but at the same time, I was kind of like, I would literally watch a show about him knitting, like, I've been enjoying all of the stuff he's done on Instagram to entertain us during the quarantine, reading Shakespeare and so forth. So, I mean, that isn't to say that I don't have a few critical opinions, but I was happy to accept almost anything, and was just so excited to see, where this character would be after all this time.
Do you go to a lot of Star Trek conventions? I don't remember if you've ever mentioned that before.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I haven't done the cruise yet. That's like another level, I think, of, do I want to be aboard a cruise ship with a bunch of Trekkies or not? Like, it's one of those things that, and actually, I would have had a very different opinion about that a couple of years ago before, Discovery came out and you realized, oh my God, right-wing Star Trek fans exist and things like that. So, yeah, I haven't, gone full overboard yet, but I'm almost there. And I do have tickets for this year's Star Trek Las Vegas, so we'll see if it remains. It's in August, so hopefully all of this, quarantine stuff will be over by then.
Yeah, so what were the two of you cosplaying as?
We had different costumes every day because, it's a 5-day thing. And so when we had scheduled photo ops with Uhura, we had TOS outfits. And when we had, scheduled photo ops with Discovery characters, we had Discovery outfits. So.
But all Starfleet uniforms?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, we had one cosplay that's my favorite with, the actress who played Dr. Gillian Taylor in The Voyage Home. And I think that one's my favorite because she was very excited because my boyfriend was Spock in the full robe and I was dressed as her in the final scene when, they have like the UN meeting and she's got that wonderful purple tunic.
That sounds great. So how about Daniel? What sort of expectations did you have going into the Picard show?
So I'm not a huge Trekkie, although Star Trek has been sort of the background music of my life for a long time. Studying computer science, studying robotics, just being in school for years and years, I was surrounded by people that were incredibly into it, to the point that it was kind of intimidating to me, actually, I think. So I've got 3 kids, and I have shown them, I'm sad to say, I've shown them Red Dwarf before they've seen Star Trek. So, as a fan, you can put me somewhere in the middle. I didn't really have a lot of expectations, but the fact is, this is Patrick Stewart, right? So there's a ton of expectations that come associated with that character and with that guy, right? I mean, he's like the most lovable actor, and his friendship with Ian McKellen is like just incredible. So he's taken on his own life outside of Picard, but and he's done so much for bald men like myself in the world.
Right there
so
with you, brother.
yeah, so I was really looking forward to just like when I hear the Next Generation music, it still just gives me chills and just makes me think, gives me so many memories that just flood over me. And it feels like coming home. It feels just so comforting. And unfortunately, I was kind of expecting that, just to melt with Picard for 10 episodes. As it turns out, that's not really what the series was trying to do. So that was a kind of a rude awakening for me. But yeah, you can, in terms of fandom, you can put me somewhere in the middle. I'm not going to conventions, but I'm definitely familiar with Star Trek, and it has a place in my heart.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've said on the show before that I would just say I'm sort of a moderate Star Trek fan. I mean, I've watched all the movies pretty much, and I watched a lot of the original series and a lot of Next Generation, and a little bit, like maybe I think I watched the first season of Deep Space. No, I think I watched more than that, but I haven't watched a ton of the other ones. Mm-hmm. But so could you sort of quantify for us, like how much are you similar to me? Or?
That sounds like exactly the amount that I've seen. I mean, I know I've seen The Next Generation again and again because it was just on. I had a roommate at some point it was just literally on all the time. It was on VHS tapes and it was just on. So, yeah.
God, I'm sorry. I apologize for doing for that.
It's funny how, when you're writing or when you're working and you listen to the same songs over and over, slowly they imprint on like a certain period of your life or a certain project. And that's really The Next Generation for me, was like studying computer science.
Yeah, well, I mean, I almost feel like I was sort of in the perfect sweet spot for this show where I have very fond memories of watching Next Generation growing up, but I don't have any huge, opinion about what this new show should have been. I'm just like, oh, I'll check this out. I like Picard, So yeah. I think that's easier for me than for a lot of hardcore fans who have very definite ideas about what they think it should be. Mm-hmm. But so let's get Melinda in here. So what were your expectations going into this new show?
Well, I was dubious, and honestly, I had no intention of watching it. I admire Patrick. He's enormously talented, fantastic actor, but I've written for Star Trek, and as my friend Rick Manning said, Star Trek put the S and the T in PTSD for those of us who work the show. So I really had no intention to watch it. I've never watched any Trek show after I left Next Generation.
I read somewhere that you... I'm sorry, I read somewhere that you worked when you were a part of the writers' team, that it was you and a bunch of men, that you were the only female for a long time?
That is correct. There was never another... After I left the show, then Jerry was hired. So, no, I was the only woman above the line writer.
I've been there.
Yeah. So the only reason I started watching was because I suddenly was being inundated by fans writing me on Facebook and Twitter saying, are you aware that they have basically used The Measure of a Man as the foundation of this entire series? And I was like, no, that's news to me. Jeez. So I went ahead and signed up for CBS All Access because I do all streaming now, and began watching. It was a little surreal for me, and I'm still kind of wrapping my head around how I feel about the whole thing. In terms of the show, I have, thoughts, which we will get into. Marvelous cast, tremendous performances, great direction, looks fabulous. But I have suggestions, let me put it to them. And I would love to offer them to them at some point. So.
Well, why don't we just explain for listeners in case you don't know that? Yeah, so I mentioned in Melinda's intro that this Next Generation episode she wrote, Measure of a Man, often voted one of the best Star Trek scripts of all time. And it's about there's a robot scientist in Starfleet who wants to disassemble Data and sort of, experiment on him and learn how he works in order to build more. And there's sort of a hearing, and Data is understandably reluctant to be involved in this process. And there's a hearing about whether he is the property of Starfleet or an independent sentient being with his own rights and free to make his own choices. And just a fantastic episode. Is there anything, Melinda, do you want to say about the experience of writing that episode, or do you have anything stick out from that time?
It comes from the fact that I was an attorney. I was trained as a lawyer. I've been an opera singer and then went to law school and, did all this crazy stuff. And because of the law school experience, when my friend George R.R. Martin offered me the opportunity to write a spec script that he would show to his agent, I grew up with Trek. And so I started watching and I fell in love with the Data character. And I realized that there was an infamous Supreme Court decision called Dred Scott that was really, could be on point for whether Data, has rights. Is he a person or is he the property of Starfleet Command? And I knew it was a good idea, and George had warned me I would never sell that spec script because you never do sell your spec script. And I was going to hold off writing that one, save that for a pitch, and George said to me, Melinda, never hoard your silver bullet, meaning lead with your best thing. So I wrote The Measure of a Man, and they not only bought the script, they then ended up hiring me onto the show for half of the second and all of the third season. So that's sort of the history of how this came up. But, this is where I do my little PSA announcement, which is kids, stay in school, go to college. Nothing you study is ever wasted, because much of my career has been defined by the fact that I had this training as an attorney. So, whatever you study, it's never wasted.
So when you say that all these people were contacting you saying that that they had sort of built on that script for this new show, what sort of things were you hearing from people? Were they excited about that? Were they scandalized? Like, what was the tone of the messages you were getting?
Well, a lot of people were very excited because, people do seem to love that script. And, but some people were, surprised that no one had informed me prior to this that was what they were doing and that I had no knowledge of it. So it was an interesting dichotomy. I mean, most people were pleased that they were using it because it certainly has powerful themes, which, give you a place to grow and build from when you're developing a series, a season of television.
And so that Bruce Maddox character, did you invent that character?
I did. I'm watching my mailbox, waiting for my character creation payment. So whoever it was who created Hugh, who are 7 of 9, we're all waiting for our character creation payments that the WGA guarantees that we get. Unfortunately, poor old Bruce croaked very early, so I only get the one payment. But, so it goes.
You were rooting for him.
I was like, oh yeah, I hope he and his girlfriend get to hang around for a long time. But no, she murdered him. So
yeah, she moved on pretty quick.
Yeah, he was gone quick, but I get my one payment, so I'll take it.
Well, so let's go back to Sarah. So Sarah, when you started actually watching the first episode of this show, kind of what were your initial impressions of it?
I loved it. It was almost surprising how carefully they were taking the character development, at the risk of infuriating people who, want. I mean, I remember actually in some of the forums that, I of course follow to my mental health detriment. Some people were like, well, it's too slow. Nothing's happening yet. And it's like, oh my God, they're clearly doing this slow build character development thing. They want you to be reacquainted with this character and let you know where he is, what mental place that he's in. Think about what the Federation what the Federation's response to this Mars incident would be. There's plenty there. So, and then of course the people who are, always saying it's too slow are the same people who are like, well, modern Trek has too much action in it. And it's like, okay, well, make up your mind. What do you want?
Well, right. I mean, I saw that Patrick Stewart was actually really reluctant to do this show. They really kind of had to sell him on it, but that he was afraid it was going to be some sort of total fan service callback where he would just, I guess he would just be doing all his, famous lines, and it would just be kind of jokey, and he didn't want to be involved in anything like that. And so I think it was Michael Chabon who ended up being the showrunner, who sort of, I think, played a big part in convincing him that no, they wanted to do something serious and respectful and, dramatically interesting and so on.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they have, from looking at it from that perspective, I think that anytime I had any doubts about the show, I would remind myself, this is sort of Patrick Stewart's baby. And just from that perspective of how he sees the character, what he wanted for the growth of the character is fascinating all by itself.
Yeah, and actually, maybe I'll get to that later, but I guess I'll just say that, a lot of fans were unsatisfied with some of the stuff that happened in Star Trek Nemesis, the last movie where we saw these characters. So I think there was some impetus to, fix maybe a little bit of that. But so Daniel, what were your initial impressions of the show?
So yeah, I was going in pretty much not having looked at anything Star Trek recently. I thought Patrick Stewart was awesome. It was like what I wanted, but I was in the camp of more infuriated at how slow things were. I like the cold open. I was a little bit bummed that the first black actor I saw was also the first one who immediately catches a knife in the chest and is killed, just because that's almost like a trope in and of itself. I was like, oh no! But with the episode, I ended up being hooked by the end, but it felt, and a lot of the series kind of felt this way to me, sort of jerky in that the scenes with Picard were sort of thoughtful character building, and then there was the rest of it sort of trying to make up for that with a lot of action, and also visuals, a lot of sort of the kind of Tony high-class science fiction visuals that, we see now in the expensive sci-fi series like Altered Carbon and Westworld and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, I don't know that this really needs that, right? Like, which side are we going to do? Are we going to do the sort of next generation, thoughtful, mostly people talking to each other? That's how everything usually feels like it gets resolved in sporadic action. Or is this going to be like an Altered Carbon, like a lot of action, a lot of really cool stuff happening? And it was kind of like doing both. And I kind of like, by the end, I wanted to see the next episode, but I was definitely on shaky ground, and just not sure really about the tone of the series. And also, I mean, this whole series is really, I mean, everything is spurred by Picard's love for Data, right? And this idea that Data had a child, and just from a robotics perspective, I just wasn't, that just didn't completely convince me. I mean, there's for instance, this really great Cory Doctorow short story about this, where a father has a daughter who uploads herself and basically gets replicated 1,000 times. And you realize, like, what does love mean whenever there's 1,000 copies of your daughter? And for me, just from a robotics perspective, I was just like, well, how does that love transfer? I mean, Data was a singular sort of entity, right? And then this idea that a piece of him was copied, there could be thousands of these synths out there. It just, for me, it didn't have like that human weight, that was really necessary to sort of like, explain everything else that's happening during the series. So I had to swallow some of my technical stuff, but I was there for it. I was ready for the next episode.
Yeah, well, maybe let's come back to some of the robot stuff and how Star Trek handles that. I want to just sort of lay out the plot. Since you mentioned the cold open for people if you haven't watched the show, basically the idea is that Picard has been retired for, I think, about 20 years. after resigning from Starfleet in protest of them not helping the Romulans evacuate. And this was sort of happens around the same time as a robot uprising that caused the Federation to ban all synthetic organisms along the lines of Data. And then a young woman comes to Picard for help and is murdered by a Romulan death squad. And Picard sort of gets the idea that she's somehow like Data's quote unquote daughter, that she was somehow created from his design. And sort of he gets wrapped up in this mystery and assembles a crew to try to go, find her twin sister and save her before the Romulans get to her. Okay, but so let's go to Melinda. So, I don't know, do you have any reaction to anything that Sarah and Daniel said there?
I actually liked the pacing. It gave me time to, for them to set the stage. I mean, so I was all right with that. I thought it looked beautiful. I mean, I just think that the aesthetics of the show are phenomenal. I mean, in terms of, I see exactly what Daniel is saying, because in fact, when we finally do get to this last 2 episodes, there are a whole bunch of them in male and female form. I mean, she isn't unique. She isn't special. She's, one of many. And for me, and in some ways I liked it because it was a very human reaction as you near the end of your life, which is, to me, it was an action to try to affirm his own life. It wasn't so much that he cared so much about Daj and Soji, and Data's gone, dead, quote unquote. I mean, how does a robot die? But, and I felt that it was for him. It was a chance for him to be alive again for a brief time, to live once more, to have purpose. And so I felt like this was more him giving a gift to himself, it reminded me of Don Quixote, okay, in these, the old man at his, being cared for by people who are saying, don't do that, you're being foolish. And he goes off to, tilt at windmills and have a great adventure. And the windmills in this case are, Starfleet and the Romulans and all the rest of it. It felt like this is much, if you try to think of this show as absolutely just about one old man's journey to find purpose at the end of his life, then I think it all sort of begins to make some sense in terms of the themes of it. That's how I was viewing it
I agree with you. And I think they played that really well in terms of his arc. Because at first you really do think he could be just tilting at windmills here. He does seem a little off kilter when he shouts, at the newscaster and everything. And it really does come together. So I agree with you. Through that lens, it does sort of click and make more sense. Because you might want that motivation to be a little shaky in your first few episodes.
Well, he has that brain abnormality, too. The brain abnormality, one of the side effects they mentioned, is sort of outbursts of anger.
Yeah, I mean, it's like dementia, right? Like, is he...
Yeah.
Is he demented, or does he really need to be out there doing something?
I mean, it's set up that he's really. I mean, I love Patrick Stewart. I loved his performance in this. I love the character. I felt a little bit like he's. They've set it up that he's disappointed so many people in his life. He's disappointed Raffi and the Romulans, and I felt like they're piling it on a little thick for me. That he's,
I think,
yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I felt like that was a really important thing to do, because one of the things with TNG is that he's surrounded by yes men. He's surrounded by people who think that he is God's gift. Pretty much all, 7 seasons. He's, and it's wonderful because there's a sense of camaraderie and you believe that every member of his crew would die for him. But, there's a lot you can't say with that too. And so putting him in the perspective of, in real life, this man would have faults. In real life, there would be people around him who would feel jilted by the lack of his attention, who would feel like he had moved past them and be hurt by that. So I really like the fact that they're exploring aspects of his character that were always there in TNG if you were paying attention, but they never really brought them to the surface.
Yeah, I think archetypically he was a mentor character, really, in TNG. And it is kind of interesting just thinking about aging and getting older. how a mentor at some point can curdle, into that Quixote-like figure, where it's like at a certain point, once you're so far enough outside your prime, do all of your lessons really and all your wisdom really add up, to be useful, and when do your faults start to appear? I guess 20 years out of the game is enough time. 94, right? Isn't he 94? Yeah. There it is.
Well, I thought it was striking, too, how dysfunctional his crew, like he's got all these problems, and then his crew is unbelievably dysfunctional, in marked contrast to, the sort of more utopian approach to Next Generation, and how Gene Roddenberry always wanted the crew to kind of be getting along with each other and working together to solve problems, and that humanity had moved past.
That made me
Pardon me while I gag momentarily.
Well, yes. Yeah, I was leading up to because I know, Melinda, that you were really frustrated. You and a lot of the other writers, I gather, were pretty frustrated by that, trying to write for Next Generation.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, because the essence of drama is conflict. And when you're told my people are perfect, they have no flaws in a meeting in Gene's office, you're like left going, well, then what the heck do I write about? I mean, if they're perfect. So it was very frustrating.
Because it's a procedural, you get to pick one flaw for each character. Everybody's keeping it together, and then you got like, oh, this one character has this one problem for this one episode, and you really get to put it under a microscope and build the episode around it, and build the drama and the technology around it, and like explore that one thing, for that 1 week.
I feel like the best of Star Trek is dark, and I don't think that people really understand it, or they're thinking about, when you think about the inner light, it's actually pretty dark. It's about a whole civilization getting extinguished. When you think it's about their whole culture and everything disappearing. When you think about Far Beyond the Stars, it's dark. When you think about A Measure of a Man, it's dark because Starfleet could have easily made the other decision. And Starfleet is flawed. And, I'm just so tired of this complaining of, that lacking this utopia thing. And Star Trek is at its best when there's conflict. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm going to disagree. So I wrote a novel called Robopocalypse, right? I mean, for real. So I come from, I spent 10 years studying robotics because I love technology. I love robots. I think there's all these opportunity to help humankind with this stuff. And then I turned around, and when I wanted to take all that knowledge that I had and turn it into fiction, I realized, like, wow, everybody has all these assumptions because there's so much science fiction that is so dark and explores the negative outcomes of technology and science. And so, I wrote Robopocalypse, and then, all the terrible things that can happen in there. And when I think beyond that, like the lowest hanging fruit, how to get a more complex story and really examine what it means to be human and think about robots and people and simulated life. And like Star Trek is really one of the few beacons that I can point to that has any sort of optimism about technology or humanity. And it is the DNA of it. And look, like maybe it's at its best when it's dark, but it's certainly not at its most unique, because that is the reason Star Trek endures, is that it's different than all the other science fiction that's just so negative, and just so dark.
If I may, I think you are confusing conflict with fear of technology or apocalyptic issues. That isn't what we wanted. What we wanted was very small human problems. If you look back at original Trek, the relationship between Kirk and Spock and McCoy, the heart, the head, and the brain, you see this. It was discussing, in fact, what you said, what makes us human. The fear was never of the technology. That wasn't, those of us, especially me, I'm a science fiction novelist, I think technology is going to be our salvation out of some of the problems we create for ourselves. But how humans deal with one another and care for one another, there are going to be, conflicts.
I agree.
I love Jonathan dearly, and he's very talented. He's a wonderful director. But it always struck me that it would have been better in some ways if he had left the show as a regular, because I found it incredible that he would continue to play second fiddle for all those years. I've never met a Navy officer who didn't immediately want to have his own ship. and even if it was a garbage scout, they wanted to be captain. And so I think there's a way to, and that was what worked so well with Measure. And fortunately, Gene was not present when we filmed it because he didn't like conflict, and that show would never have been filmed the way it was because there was a hint of conflict between Picard and Riker. Because of the way I used it in the Navy tradition where a captain always defends and the first officer always prosecutes when you don't have access to a JAG office. And it gave us that sense of, here was a younger man, a young buck who wants to, lock horns with the older man, and yet it's also his friend who's at stake. That's the kind of conflict that has resonance for me. I don't need, that's the problem with the superhero movies. It's too big. The problems are too big. New York will be destroyed. The Earth will be destroyed. The universe will be destroyed. Something smaller and more personal is far more meaningful and moving to me, anyway.
Yeah. Well, let me jump in because I'm kind of with Daniel a little bit on this, in that and granted, my memories of Next Generation are from when I was.
Well, I agree with Melinda completely.
Okay, well, let me agree with you first, then you can agree with Melinda. But just in the sense that, like my memories of Next Generation anyway, the idea that this is, a better future where people get along better, really stuck with me. And watching this new show, I enjoyed it quite a lot. But I felt like it had more of the tone or more of the characters like Firefly or something, which is, totally great. But it's just like not the way I remember Star Trek. And so I think there is some legitimacy to just noting that, that change in tone.
And if you look at the stakes of Star Trek Picard, they are totally Marvel stakes. All organic life will be destroyed by giant tentacles coming through a vortex in space. Oh, yes,
please, God.
So, you've got, 15 synthetics on a beautiful planet that they have all to themselves, and they're like, well, let's sacrifice all organic life in the universe. I don't know. The stakes definitely felt out of proportion, right? To the situation.
Yes, 100%. That's really how I felt.
Better if it was
but we're jumping ahead to the end, which I think will upset David.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm very, very upset right now.
I just wanted to add that, when I say Star Trek is at its best when it's dark, what I mean is that Star Trek is at its most hopeful when it is dark. And so for me, it's always weird to hear this weird dichotomy between, this idea that you can either have a Star Trek that's dark and deep, or you can have a Star Trek that's light and hopeful. And I just don't see it that way. To me, it's like the darker that you make Star Trek, as long as you do it honestly, the more you have hope. And I don't know why, I don't know whether it's bizarre to see it like that, but that's how I've always seen it. And so it's a very strange thing for me. And you have to understand.
Let me just ask you, Sarah, do you not see that, or do you not see it that the crew in Next Generation gets along better and has less problems than this crew in Picard, and that's a different.
I think that TNG was not emotionally honest. I think that on the whole, there were little bright spots of it, and we've talked about this. My upbringing, Star Trek was this extraordinary influence on me. I was being raised by Christian conservatives. I took to Star Trek like a barnacle. I was soaking it in and sucking it up every day. I watched it. I was homeschooled. I watched it 5 hours a day because I just needed to believe that there was a universe that wasn't this horrible thing surrounding me, telling me that men were in charge, that women were dirt, that God found human beings to be, that humans were lost without God, all of this horrible stuff that you're taught as a child when you're raised in a religious environment. And so I do see that optimism, but I use optimism in air quotes because I feel like what they actually did is it was a sleight of hand. Okay, so for instance, when you have a red shirt die, the reason why we have a whole meme about red shirts, and it was true in TNG and Voyager, it's just that they didn't wear the color red because they had caught on by then, but you still had characters you never saw before who showed up to die, and they did that because you wouldn't you wouldn't have to have these dark feelings, and you wouldn't be, exposed to having feelings and being sad in Star Trek because you're killing a disposable character. And that's a trick. That's not honest.
Okay, I agree with you there, but if you think about the crew dynamic, and the point that you're making, Dave, is something that I have thought about a lot watching Picard. The crew dynamic, I mean, they're out there essentially sort of solving puzzles together, right? And then sometimes the puzzles are dangerous and people get killed and it can't be, any of the main cast. But the crew dynamic is, they're working together and everything is built on honesty and like respect and trust, right? They all trust the other person to do their job. They all have this respect for each other at the end of the day, even though they have differences. And then you look at Picard, and it was really the opposite. This crew dynamic is built on not telling the truth to each other. Every character ends up having a secret. They don't trust each other at all, and they don't ultimately respect each other. And so, it was just a big departure. I mean, it's not that you can't have an awesome show with that kind of crew dynamic, but there's some part of anybody that's going to watch this that's going to think Picard's going to get the old gang back together, they're going to go out and it's going to be like it was. And they really go completely 180 to that. And so, I don't know, around midway through the season, they finally got this crew, everything's going, and you realize, oh, this ain't going to be, the Picard that we saw before. This crew dynamic is built on, I guess the macro lesson of this season, which is Picard sitting back and letting people make bad decisions if they want to, and letting them grow if they can.
Well,
see, to me, that crew dynamic is still there, and I am genuinely confused by, they take longer to get to know each other, right? But that's because it's realistic, and by the end, they are very much united and, very familial.
Yeah. I mean, didn't one of them murder another one and then...
And they just forgive her?
Start hooking up with the next...
You're going to argue about who
sorry.
killed who.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's the way my brain operates, and I'm going to just... sip it.
Yeah, well, no, I think these are all good points, but I want to get to some other aspects of the show before we run out of time too much. And I did want to come back, Daniel, to what you were saying about the robotic stuff and how the show handles that. Do you want to just say a little bit more about, just as a someone with a PhD in robotics, what are some things we ought to be talking about in terms of the presentation of AI in the show?
Well, I mean, I think that it's not great to try to think of it from a technological standpoint, because what's clearly happened with this series, which I think is great, is they went to great lengths to ground it, and not make it so much of a space opera. For instance, they put his office from the vineyard on the ship, right? So this is not, you're not meant to, feel like you're watching a show where you're just on a spaceship constantly. And I think they did that in an interesting way to me, although ultimately I wish they would have explored the synths more. They really explored them from an emotional standpoint. My sort of feeling about robots has always been, why do they want to be human? They're their own thing. They should explore their own abilities. They should be proud to be robots. They shouldn't want to conform to humanity. But that's Data's deal, and it's an interesting perspective to explore. And that's really what they stick to, So even at the end, when these synths are making this decision about whether they're going to destroy all organic life or whether they're being oppressed or what their lives are worth, right? It's not logical at all. They're not presenting evidence. It's all emotional, right? So I kind of found that the synthetics were it wasn't really an exploration of robotics or technology. It was really an emotional exploration of synthetic life, of the idea that you are just like this thing, but you are not that thing. And so, from that perspective, it was really interesting, but I don't think it had much to do with robotics.
Well, this maybe risks dragging us back into the same conversation, but it sort of occurs to me that, we kind of want robots to be rational, and at least Daniel and I want the characters to be more rational. But emotions is really what makes a good story in a lot of ways, or what engages viewers. So I don't know if maybe I want to get Melinda back in here. What do you think about what Daniel's saying about, like, are these really robots or just sort of humans dressed as robots to tell a good story?
I felt like they were more just humans dressed up, pretending to be robots. I mean, the idea that you would make a robot that needs to eat and excrete strikes me as kind of a waste of time. I mean, why would you do that? I mean, if Soji and Daj were supposed to infiltrate humanity, okay, then I can understand it, but it just sort of, it didn't make any sense to me at all. Why you would give all of these limitations that frankly humans have to your creation that could in some ways be superior, which, immediately takes me to this whole thing where they download the consciousness, which made me crazy in the final episode. Great, I'm going to be in a 90-some-year-old body? What? I mean, I'm just...
I gotta say, I would definitely want to be knock a couple years off of that body, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I found it all very strange. I mean, I guess if I could keep thinking of this as Don Quixote, then it sort of makes sense to me. But in terms of what they were trying to say thematically, I'm really not sure at this point.
Yeah, well, and there also is just a weird conflict between high technology and emotionally grounded stories. And, how many Star Trek stories have had somebody come back from the dead at this point? And so, yeah, but I don't know how you solve that exactly. I mean, especially since this is, farther in the future than all the other Star Trek shows, you would expect the technology to just keep getting more and more sophisticated and capable.
If we're talking, though, about these themes, I thought that the stuff with the Borg reclamation, that was really interesting to me. This idea that you've lost part of your humanity, you've become part of this collective, and then you've come back. And I mean, to me, those were the most interesting themes related to robotics, and the idea of having non-organic parts and then having those removed, and then counting it up and tallying it up and seeing what's left, right? That the Hugh character and all of those, when Picard comes back on the Borg ship, like, dude, I was really digging that. I was having a lot of fun, and I felt like that was really emotional too. And it was like this real sweet spot between the technology being portrayed kind of realistically, and then also a lot of emotionality from his experiences that he'd had there.
Yeah, I interviewed this guy, Manu Sadia. He wrote a book called Trekonomics, and I forget if he had come up with this or he was quoting somebody, but he was basically saying that the Borg, in some way, is sort of the logical extension of the Federation. That they sort of it's like everything that the Federation is, the Borg is just like times 10.
Really?
Hypercolonialism.
Yeah, but I thought the Prime Directive meant that they're not colonizing.
Well, in terms, I guess, in terms of the, how about Sarah? Why don't you jump in here?
Well, I mean, it's another one of those things where you have a paradox with the Federation, right? Because on so many levels they are very colonialist. They really are. And so, what Manu was saying, where the Borg were, sort of a hyper extension of the Federation, or even in Discovery, when they talk about the concept of extremist Vulcans, extremist logic, where, if another species is inferior, then of course you kill them, that kind of thing. So, I appreciate the fact that they've taken away from some of that colonialism of TNG, where, the hero swoops in and rescues, the planet, or rescues the other constantly. And, with the parallels for that are, kind of disturbing when you think about them.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So I feel like I've done a remarkably bad job at summarizing the plot of this as we've gone along. So I apologize to anyone who's listening to this who hasn't actually seen the show. But it's a very complicated story, so I don't know if I'm even going to bother at this point. But I don't know, Sarah, did you have what did you think of the Borg in this show? Was it pretty much, do you think it's pretty similar to how the Borg's been portrayed in the past, or did you think the reclamation thing?
I loved the reclamation thing because I think they were really honest about the trauma that would actually be involved in having this happen to you. You know, I mean, again, I love these shows so much. I've seen all of them. There are over 600 hours of Star Trek to watch, and I've seen all of it. and I love it so much, but the more I love it, the more comfortable I am saying, yeah, that. And, I mean, they sort of wove a magic wand and said, that, oh, well, you're supposed to infer that by then we have sophisticated counseling. We have sophisticated, psychotherapists who can go in and fix these problems. And you don't have Picard having PTSD, and Picard would have PTSD. Kirk would have PTSD. There's just, you can have, I wish that they would actually have an episode that explained how mental health works in the future, because they're just assuming. You're assuming as part of that sleight of hand that they've set up in this quote unquote utopian environment that they figured this out. So I love the fact that they actually dealt with the trauma and displayed these XBs as trauma survivors.
Well, maybe
and I also think that they set it up as a contrast so that you could see the difference between the Borg and what Dr. Soong was trying to do, or the Soongs now.
Yeah. Well, maybe the reason there's no PTSD is because every time someone dies, it's like, I don't actually know who that was. So.
I thought it was really, I mean, kind of the key. One thing I do in my writing is I'll take a robot and then I'll give it more and more human attributes until the line's blurred, or I'll take a human and give them more and more robotic attributes. And I think that's part of the fundamental question about, synthetic life is when you take a collection of parts and you slowly start taking it closer to humanity, or you take a human and slowly start adding parts, at what point do you tip over into a non-human entity, or what point do you reach humanity? And I mean, there's that really grisly scene at the beginning of one of the episodes where they're just cutting parts out of a former Borg, I guess, or a Borg, yeah. And it's like, is that a screaming human being, or is that a collection of parts that's just being disassembled? And I mean, it's a really fun, interesting question, and I think that they managed to get a little bit of they managed to really go a little ways with it in those episodes.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Melinda, because Melinda, this is, sort of what your script Measure of a Man dealt with, is what makes Data human or not. I'm just curious, have you, if you were to write that script today, would you do everything the same, or in the intervening years, have you thought about the issue, and was there anything you would change now?
I probably wouldn't. I mean, the ultimate truth is that Data is not human, but is he worthy of being allowed to exist without belonging to someone else? I think was the real issue. The issue of whether he's human or not was never truly resolved. The issue was, does he have the right to make his own choices about his quote unquote life? Or is he merely, no different than the computer on the Enterprise, or, a toaster, which I had Riker say.
Yeah.
Or no, I guess it was Maddox who calls him a toaster. But, that was really the essential. So no, I wouldn't change the fundamentals of what I did, because I don't think they ever get to the question. I mean, what surprised me though is when I found out they had in fact built this army of synths all on Mars doing whatever they were doing, I guess building these rescue ships. I was like, didn't you just say that? I mean, wasn't the whole point of the scene between Guinan and Picard that shouldn't be the ultimate result? And yet they went ahead and did it anyway, which seemed like they overruled their own ruling to build this army of synths. I mean, I think that's what look, I enjoyed the show ultimately because I thought it was marvelously acted and beautifully directed. But I just felt like there wasn't a lot of thought into some of the ramifications. Structurally, I think there were problems with the episodes and with the overall arc of the season that, needed to be looked at and addressed. I mean, I had all these questions like, why did Maddox leave his little, utopian planet with his creations? I mean, why was he even wandering around the Stardust Lounge or whatever that place was? Why, and why did we, and when I got to the end of that finale, I'm a big video game player, and I played Mass Effect all the way through all 3 games like 3 times, and I was like, well, they better send for Commander Shepard, and
the Reapers, yeah, that's ancient artificial intelligences.
Yeah, and artificial creatures coming to reap all organic life. And, then, okay, so they turned off the beacon. I mean, if they're that high powered, they know exactly where that beacon came from.
There was that little thing that they just slip in at the end where she goes, now that the synths have been made legal. And I was like, what? Like, you just showed that you guys definitely shouldn't be legal. Like, you came like 30 seconds away from killing all organic life
in our galaxy. I know. I loved Agnes because she was the one person who got to be smart-mouthed occasionally. But she is a murderess. I mean, is there no law and justice left in this universe? I just had issues, and they kept setting up things that I wanted, like, tell me about the Romulan space pirate. Who was that guy? And why did he suddenly come back and attack everybody? I mean, there was this wonderful possibility in that episode where Picard goes back to whatever that planet was. I'm sorry, I can't remember all the names. And Rios says, well, cash gift is always acceptable. Why didn't they have him have to pay the bribe to the Romulan pirate? And then the Romulan pirate gets mad because the check bounces or something. I mean, give me some explanation. You set up all this cool stuff, and then they didn't carry it, for me, to its logical conclusions. There were so many things where I was aching to know more, see more, spend more time in this universe without, oh my God, all of organic life is going to be destroyed.
I wanted to answer one of the criticisms. I forget which one of you had, but in terms of the reversal of the ban, I think that it was clear that they reversed the ban because they proved that the attack on Mars had been a conspiracy that was initiated by the Tal Shiar, and that those synths were hacked. But
my feeling
don't
is that
think that they made it obvious enough that that Starfleet had figured that out. Like, Picard basically told them that this is what happened, but then you don't see the reaction. You don't see the Federation going, "Oh God, we did this because we were manipulated."
Yeah, but so my kind of feeling about that is that if you've got a technology that can be hacked and 100,000 people can be killed, whether or not the technology was sentient and made the decision, or whether the technology was hacked, it doesn't change the outcome. It's still an extremely dangerous technology that in its current incarnation should be banned, right? I mean,
it would be true of ships. You could take a Starfleet ship and hack it and do terrible damage. So it would be true of any technology, whether it was a quote-unquote sentient life or not.
I guess my other problem that I had with it, profound problem I had with it, was it made no sense that the Romulans did this. The synths were building ships to save their people. And because of this action, billions of their own people died. And, that just struck me as they couldn't wait till after they rescued the home world before they had the synths go nuts and kill a bunch of people. I mean, that to me was another problem. I mean, it's the same problem about why didn't the pissed off Romulans go home and tell everybody when they came back in time, hey, the star's going to go nova, we all need to leave. I mean, it was that kind of, it did not seem reasonable to me that's when the event would occur, that you would do that to kill so many of your own people. I mean, I found it baffling, and it was just, again, one of those things where did nobody in the writer's room go, wait a minute?
I thought that they did that because they were trying to make a point about terrorism. That, you could say the same thing about why did 9/11 happen? Surely these people could have, surely these terrorists would see that we would, that America being the country that it is, unfortunately, the militaristic country that it is, surely we would smash them into smithereens over the next decade or several decades or however long it lasts. But, isn't the point that terrorism is fundamentally irrational and fundamentally self-harming?
Yeah, I don't want to get
That'll
too
have
much,
to be the point.
I don't want to get too much into 9/11 too much, but I mean, I think that, that's a fair point, but I feel like there's so many, like Melinda's saying, there's so many unanswered questions in the show. And I certainly, I was also wondering, why did Bruce Maddox leave that planet at all? And I'm still honestly a little confused about why he sent Daj.
We definitely didn't see enough of Bruce. I absolutely agree with that. I would have loved to see more of Bruce, especially to connect, the character that we knew from Melinda's story, to now, and that connection just sort of faltered, and it felt like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, Melinda, what did you think of how how your character was used in this show?
Well, obviously, I was disappointed, and not just monetarily. I mean, because it actually isn't very much money. I just felt like I didn't recognize that man, as the character I created. And granted, it's 30 years on, okay, but I mean, clearly he and this young woman loved each other. I mean, they were partners in every sense of the word. And the fact she would just, none of it worked for me. And I felt like I needed him to help explain some of this. I mean, it was really nice seeing Brent. Brent's great. I love him. He's a good friend. But, why couldn't it have been Bruce? I mean, who's trying to explain why he broke the law and fled to this place and has done this thing, and and how much Data meant to him. In some ways he loved Data more than Picard did, because he found a way to resurrect him, to save him, and to give Data his greatest dream, which was to have a child, to have a daughter. And so I felt like it was a waste of the character, and I'm not sure why they made the decision. I mean, they did seem to do a whole lot of wiping out of older characters. Hugh, dies, not exactly sure why, what, he seemed like I don't know the character because I don't watch the show, but from what I saw of him in Picard, this looked like an interesting character that I would have liked to have known more about. I think there's so much there, but I just hope they haven't written themselves into a corner with the giant tentacle things that are coming from whatever galaxy. I mean, I liked it more when it was a story that it was very small and personal. And I'm going to cling to my Don Quixote. When it was about Don Quixote and he hasn't found his Dulcinea yet, but where is this going? I would rather have had that than a galaxy spanning threat,
Yeah. I'll say, like, overall, I like the show, and most of the stuff I just went with. But the one thing that really didn't work for me is when Agnes murdered Bruce Maddox. Like, and I just feel like if the character's going to do that, there has to be something in her personality that's, consistent with that or kind of converges with that. And I just felt like every single thing we knew about her made it hard to believe that she would do that. And so that was just the one thing where, like, I never got over my just like, what? Over that whole kind of subplot.
That was the one part of the Bruce Maddox things that I liked, that I felt worked.
Okay, well, so why do you say that, Sarah?
Because I think, again, it's Chabon tends to be sometimes a little bit too subtle. And, I think because he's thinking as a novelist, and with television, there's a lot of show don't tell, but sometimes there's just not enough in there, because you had this character have this really intense traumatic experience where she was mind melded with, without consent, first and foremost, but then something really awful was injected into her brain. And so I feel like they should have done a better job explaining how traumatic that was for her. I mean, she vomited immediately after, but you know, the lasting effects of something like that, there were just a few key places where I think it would have made that death so much more believable. And I think I just read into that as a reflection of trauma, as a statement about trauma and what it does to you and what you're willing to do. But I think it was also very much against her character. Like, they showed how unsettled she was by it, and how, you know, this really wasn't the job for her.
Yeah, I think trauma would have been a good way for them to motivate that if they'd leaned on it more. But I feel like probably what happened is they were thinking thematically, and they were thinking about what it means to sacrifice something you love to save a lot of other people, right? And like that's like thematically what they play with for the rest of the series with her. You know, they eventually call her the mother to the synths, and it appears that she's, turned traitor again in the last episode when she agrees to start working for them. And it seems like she's willing to sort of make a sacrifice in order to keep these other people alive. And I just think that maybe they got too wrapped up thinking about that from a thematic standpoint, and then they sort of forced the character to go through these thematic motions, you know, that weren't very well motivated.
Yeah, I also feel like from a storytelling standpoint that the explanation for why she did this is a flashback that happens like an episode or two after she does it, so that at the time she does it, it just comes completely out of nowhere. And
but that's the goal, right? It's like meant to be a slap in the face, like, what?
I don't know. I just feel like some things like that need to be set up somehow, that, you know, that when they happen, you're like, I just feel like if it's completely out of nowhere, I don't know. Just from a storytelling standpoint, that doesn't work for me.
I'm sorry, I saw that coming from 10 miles away.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, that she was going to kill her. I was like, okay, yeah. She's going to kill, okay, yeah, she's going to kill her.
I agree with Melinda.
But probably from a plot mechanic standpoint, right? Because you're like, why else was this character in this story or something? But not because it seemed consistent with her personality in any way as it had been established, or her actions.
I mean, you were wondering why she was on the ship, you know, and there was kind of something there about the fact that she showed up at Chateau Picard with this big rifle, and so there were always little seeds of doubt that I think the writers put there to make you think there's something about her. Even when, not Girardi, the other one, Raffi kind of says she hasn't been vetted. Why are you just letting her on board this ship? All of that works very well, especially, I mean, I rewatched the whole thing the other day, and the seeds are there, they're just really subtle.
Yeah, well, I've only watched this once, so maybe if I go back and watch it, I'll see more. I guess Melinda was saying there's just so many loose ends and unanswered questions and everything, and that just makes me think, is that particular to Picard, or could you say the same thing about pretty much any iteration of Star Trek, or is this, a particular offender in that regard?
Regular Star Trek is worse, because you have characters go through things, incredible, life-changing things, and then they go back, it's the reset button, they go back to the exact same character the next week, and you're like, what happened? Surely this is enough that this would be part of his character.
And look, I understand. I mean, Patrick Stewart is Patrick Stewart, and he's, marvelous actor, and Picard is an incredible character. But if you're going to make a death not matter for me, I hate that where people die and it's meaningless. Don't ask me for an emotional response and then tell me it doesn't matter. I mean, it was clear he was going to get downloaded into another body. But if they really, I think, wanted to be bold and challenging, then I would have downloaded his consciousness into a completely different body and cast a different actor who then has to try to be Jean-Luc Picard, but this new person.
I do not envy that hypothetical actor.
Yeah.
But what an incredible, I mean, that would be, it would have been, really interesting and exciting to see. And it would be a tour de force for an actor. And I'm sure there are plenty of fine British actors who would love the opportunity. And as this man figures out, I have a new life now. I don't.
I smell a Jumanji sequel.
I wanted, instead of just, oh yes, and yes, he didn't really die because we downloaded his consciousness. I wanted something more interesting at the end than, and again, I saw that coming from 8,000 miles away. So, there was no emotion at all when he, quote, died, because I was like, okay, yeah, they're just going to download him. I felt let down by this, by the end of it. I thought there was so much that was interesting, and then it just felt like the air went out of it.
I kind of agree, but I'm curious how people felt about the whole series arc. So, for me, I thought it started out with a strong first episode. The next couple episodes were really hard for me to get through, and honestly, if I wasn't doing this, I probably would have been thrown off the horse right there. But then it started getting really good, and I think it really peaked like right around episode 8 or something. And then the next two, where I was hoping like, oh my God, this thing is, if it all comes together, it's going to be crazy. There were just a couple of too many loose ends for me as well, and my suspension of disbelief got punctured, and the whole airship kind of came down. But there were some moments, like especially when I forget which of the twins it is, but she fights her, the Romulans try to kill her and she fights her way out of the board ship. Like, I mean, I was really vibing with the season right around then, like right after the midpoint. And it got really good, I thought.
I mean, overall, I thought as a TV show, I thought it was really entertaining. My main reservation, as I said, was that I wasn't sure it felt Star Trek enough for me personally, but I had no trouble like watching every episode and being interested and wanting to watch the next one.
Yeah, I think what people have to understand, and this is true about Discovery and about Picard, is that each season is an episode. Now that we have, this wonderful, new golden age of television where we are allowed to tell 8-10 hour stories. I mean, I think that movies are starting to feel like short stories, because we have these wonderful, rich 10-hour stories. And so to me, I feel like if you view all of season 1 as, of Discovery as an episode, it's totally classic Star Trek. And, even what you were saying with, things picking up around the middle, that would be the climax. And, of Star Trek Picard, the whole series is one episode, and they're really focusing on one story. If you had taken the Inner Light and, had this captain who was Captain Picard, but another character on this other planet, and you stretched that over 10 hours, people would have been furious. They would have been like, what happened? What's going on? But then the end would have been incredibly satisfying, incredibly emotional.
What do people think about, I want to mention the death of Data, the sort of revised death of Data. And then we haven't really talked about, Riker and Troy and, the characters, 7 of 9 returning. How did everyone feel about how the sort of classic characters beside Picard were handled in the show?
I loved it. Not Data's end, but I loved it when Frakes was back, and I loved it when 7 of 9 came back. Like, I was really into it. It made me, especially that episode where they spend time. Actually, I'm sorry. Someone remind me of the name of the replicant. Is it Soji?
Yeah, Soji.
When she's like recovering from the trauma of finding out that she's a machine, and everybody's making pizza, I was just like, I felt like I was at home or something.
Yeah, and that episode was so different, in my memory at least, from all the other episodes in terms of being much more kind of laid back and character driven and not having space tentacles or anything. See, Melinda, what did you think of that episode where Picard goes to Riker's house?
I liked it. It was really nice, seeing Troy and Riker, and that, yay, they got married. Good. That was nice. And I loved the daughter. I thought she was a wonderful character. And because in many ways she and Soji are kind of the same age, and that moment of youth and bonding, I liked all of that. The Data end, in a weird way for me, and I was the data whisperer on the show when I was on the show, it felt right. It felt right that he would just say, I'm weary, the time has come. And so that actually worked for me far more than that. To me was more emotionally satisfying than Picard's supposed dying. And when earlier Daniel said about the show feeling jerky, I think that's one of the things that I certainly felt in that final episode is just too many notes, Herr Mozart. It was like there were so many things happening that I didn't truly buy or accept, and the solution felt too easy. I don't know. It felt all over the place at the end. So I thought that was a problem, and I hadn't looked at the whole show as being jerky, but I'm going to, reflect on that. I think you may be onto something there.
Well, I agree that seems like the inevitable end for Data, given just his character arc over all the years, is for him to choose to become mortal and die. It's a very sort of, Asimov's Bicentennial Man. Kind of that does seem to be where everything was always leading.
I had a secret hope in my heart that the answer to I want to become mortal and die would be, we're going to put you into a mortal body, just like Picard's new body, and we're going to have Data as a character that we can play with and see in season 2, And then he just sort of turned into a vapor, and I was like, oh, I really wanted to see more of this guy. I would love to have him along for the adventure for the next season.
Yeah, it would almost make sense for Data's consciousness to be transferred into Picard's dying body, right? I don't know if that's too weird.
No, that's super weird, dude. Talk about, that's like torture. That's diabolical. What a weird way to die.
Sarah, what'd you think of the familiar characters coming back?
I loved it. I really loved to see Troy as this wounded mama bear who lost her baby, who lost her kid. It was really just giving her a moment to shine, and also the fact that she's so insightful with Soji and that she schools the men on the obviousness of what this woman is going through. I loved that. I absolutely loved it. And I also loved Kestra, the daughter. She was actually wearing like I forget the band, but her I saw this in one of the forums. Somebody noticed that the t-shirt that Kestra was wearing was like either like a Sex Pistols or in Klingon t-shirt. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. This little, I think a lot of the little details in the show were really, really handled well. But yeah, I mean, the death of Data, the real death of Data, was so much better than it was in Nemesis. And honestly, I don't remember being moved in Nemesis, and I think because I did not believe that he was dead. I thought, they'll bring him back, which they did. I was right. It just took like 20 years.
Yeah, well, since you mentioned the forum, Sarah, I mean, because like I didn't get a chance really to read any reviews or anything, but I did type in Star Trek Picard into YouTube, and it seems to be all just like angry people upset about everything. Yeah,
there's a lot of angry people on YouTube, and it's unfortunate because they get money off of advertising revenue, and so they've learned that rage sells. They've learned that sort of toxic fandom sells, and a lot of these people are just really, I mean, it's depressing. So I stay away from YouTube. That's one thing that, like, I'm mostly on Twitter and on Facebook, and that is the extent of YouTube is like the abyss beneath the ocean that no one wants to go to.
Yeah. Let me point out a couple things I thought were pretty cool in the show. I liked the idea of super advanced AIs creating an octenary star system to serve as a kind of beacon for people to come pay attention to their message. I thought it was pretty cool.
What a flex, right?
And
I actually thought they were going somewhere else with that. I thought in the end that she was going to contact them anyway, contact this entity anyway, and that the entity was going to come down and basically be better at being the Federation than the Federation was, and say, you both misinterpreted this message. We are here to protect this, this wonderful artificial intelligence. We are here to advocate for them and serve as their protectors. But we are not here to exterminate humans. And I thought it would have been so cool to shame the Federation and, say, how could you have reacted this way? And because I think that also would address kind of the colonialistic, aspects of the Federation always swooping in and saving the day, which, they're still kind of doing a little bit of.
I've got the biggest, fastest starship in the universe. Yeah, just from a roboticist's perspective, like, I was very sad that they went straight for the robopocalypse there. Just in terms of robots, advanced synthetic life equals very bad things, and they're just giant tentacles that are going to kill all organic life. It just feels so one note and not complex.
Well, that said, it is a theory on all the forums that this is actually to tie back into Discovery with Control and all of the things that they did in season 2 of Discovery, which I think would be interesting if that is true.
Melinda, do you have anything you want to throw in here?
No, not really. I'm actually more interested in people than, big tentacles, big killer tentacles. I was thinking about the characters. The character of the new characters that worked best for me was frankly Rios. I found him a great character, and especially the fact that he's bifurcated himself. I still don't understand how these holograms can actually physically do stuff, but okay, I'll let it go. But the idea that he had placed his trauma in these different entities was, I thought, a really cool idea, and I thought he was a terrific character. I'm disappointed in what they did with the Romulan kid, whose name I can never remember. Elnor, he's the elf warrior. I was like, why are you using a sword in an era that has blasters or, phasers? And that baffled me. I mean, I hope there's something they're going to actually do with that character. And Rafi, I felt, was wasted. And I think she's probably got tons of range that we never got to see. I mean, you were uncomfortable, Daniel, about the knife in the heart of the one African American. I was uncomfortable that the one African American character was a druggie and a drunk. I was like, really? We have to go that route right now. And no sense of who was her husband and, the kid, and that all came out of nowhere. I just feel like there's a lot to be explored there, and I hope they do so in interesting ways, in as interesting a way as they did with Rios, because I feel like they left some of those characters very two-dimensional.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really liked that Rios had split himself up into all those hologram personalities, and I'm not an expert on Star Trek, but I feel like that's something that at least I've never seen before. I think maybe it hasn't been done before, and to after 600 episodes of Star Trek, to come up with anything cool that hasn't been done before is kind of an accomplishment. And I really like Sarah's idea about what she was saying about the AI. The AI should have been, more enlightened than the Federation.
Amen. I agree. I thought it would be a much more uplifting Star Trek ending when they contact them, and it turns out to be, I don't know, a little Jewish lady who comes through and goes, "Hey guys, what are you doing? Let me talk to you. You all need to sit down in your corners, and we're going to fix this." Just something other than big killer tentacles.
Yeah, I mean, because my thing with AIs in movies is I feel like they always tend to be they fall into two extremes. They're either killer robots, or the robots are like the new civil rights movement, and we have to, accept them. And I feel like there's just a lot of possibilities that AI or that artificial intelligence characters could have that don't fall into one of those two extremes.
Yeah, I'm with you. Or the other extreme stereotype is the robot that wants to be a human. But that, again, I think is in the DNA of Star Trek, so there's no way to get out of that.
I'm just going to point out one other thing I thought was cool. Is I thought that I don't know how much of the stuff about Romulan culture was pre-existing, but I really liked the idea that Romulan houses always have a fake front door and that the actual door is in the back somewhere.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea that Romulans have different names for outsiders, for family, and for their significant other. I thought that was a cool idea. Although I thought it was weird then that Narek's sister calls him Narek. And you would think she would have a different name since she's a family member. But I I don't know, leaving that aside. I thought it was a cool idea. So yeah, I don't know. I think we're running a little short on time here. I think that's all my notes there. Anyone have any other topics they want to bring up relating to the show that we haven't touched on?
I want to defend Elnor.
Okay. Go for it.
I think part of the reason why I love Elnor is that, he's sort of the unsocialized character, and there's a lot of exploring with that with Soji. Soji is also unsocialized, and in the end, Picard recognizes that in order to teach, these synths, he's going to have to become a parent, and he's going to have to lead by example. But I felt like Elnor was this delightful, rejection of toxic masculinity. On one hand, that he was, sort of could kill you very easily, but was this wonderfully emotional and wonderfully expressive character who dealt in absolute candor, who just said what he was thinking and what he was feeling. And that is a wonderful thing to see in a especially young male, stereotypically action figure character. And just the fact that he was raised by Romulan death nuns by a bunch of women, I loved it. And especially I think that that character is also supposed to represent the audience, or the Trekkies, the really, dyed-in-the-wool, like, I will probably cry for a month when Patrick Stewart, the person, dies. So I totally cried when the character dies. I couldn't help myself. But even though I knew they were going to bring him back as well. But I feel like, that Elnor, in weeping at the end, and that he had these sort of daddy issues for Star Trek Picard, I feel like they were saying something about the Trekkies and their relationship to this character.
Yeah, I also actually, another thing I really liked was how his order, they only pledged themselves to what they considered to be a lost cause. I thought that was a great
Yeah, that was cool.
There was, what I loved about him was that the sort of, he was definitely comic relief. And like the comic relief was implicit in knowing the context that he always tells the truth, right? And so then whenever he says, I don't like you, I love it, right? Or whatever. And I really, I was waiting. I knew someone had to do it. But when the Romulan guy at the end goes, I choose to live. I choose to live. Like, that really cracked me up, because it's like, yeah, he's always asking this question and no one ever gets the right answer. But like that, and whenever he displays emotion, it just is so implicitly truthful that it's really funny and refreshing, because he's just swimming in a sea of deceit, right? Everyone is lying. Everyone has a terrible secret, and he's just sort of swimming along.
Oh, and I have one other note here of something I liked. I really liked how Raffi, when she goes into Rios's cabin, she sees his record player and calls it a Walkman, and that from the standpoint of hundreds of years in the future, like the record player, a Walkman, it's all kind of the same antiquated technology. All right, cool. So why don't we start wrapping this up? So let's get some final thoughts from everyone. So Melinda, any final thoughts on Star Trek Picard?
I'm going to have to wait and see if I want to watch the second season. My jury is still out on that. I haven't decided yet. If they are going to tie it into Discovery, then it's going to become inexplicable to me, because I don't watch Discovery. So that might argue against it, and that would be disappointing. There are characters there I've come to really care about.
Yeah, well, let's all hope that they download Bruce Maddox into a new body so that you get some more royalties.
Well, thank you.
What if they duplicate him 1,000 times? That could be a gold mine.
I love it. Do I get a payment for everyone? We'll find out. That's a WGA question.
A11, Bruce Maddox A12.
So how about Daniel? Final thoughts?
You know what? I think that I obviously had like logic problems and some of this stuff, but I enjoyed myself, and I will be watching anything that Patrick Stewart is in. Essentially, I mean, he is. We've all kind of said it, but like, you should just put that up front. Like, he carries this thing. Like, he's amazing. And his speech, I didn't cry when he died at the end, but I was getting a little. My eyes weren't dry, during his speeches at the end. And like, I mean, he's amazing, and you have to watch whatever he's in, basically. So I'll be along for season 2.
Well, right, there's this part near the end when he's making the speech to the synthetics, trying to get them to turn away from contacting the space tentacles, where he's a force of nature. He's so persuasive, and then one of the characters says, like, "Oh, you with your granite face and steely determination, all this stuff," and really sort of, underlines what just happened. You're like, yeah, that's exactly what happened. Like, he could sell me on anything. He's so, just such a force
I think as an actor, he's got that character dialed in, and I think that it provides kind of a lodestar for the series, because no matter how many sort of logical things don't make sense, I think Picard himself will always make sense, because Patrick Stewart isn't going to get in front of a camera and say something that he is this character. He knows this character, he embodies this character, and I think that he isn't going to lead anybody astray.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Sarah, final thoughts.
I also just never got a chance to say that I really love what they did with the Seven character. They, in Voyager, I actually stopped watching Voyager when the episode came on where she was revealed to the crew, because she, went from being this newfound Borg, this, again, unsocialized, totally has no idea how to be a human, and they immediately put her in stilettos and a skin-tight compression suit. And it was just the silliest thing. It broke the fourth wall. It was so silly, especially the stilettos. And then they had this whole thing where the doctor is the one who came up with the stilettos. Like, oh, I picked what I thought would be comfortable for you. Bullshit. There's no way that they would give a woman heels of that height in the 24th century and say that is, So anyway, the fact that
she had much more of a Sarah Connor vibe this time around.
Yeah, the fact that we could see Seven not only own her trauma and have a realistic response to it, but also just be dressed in normal fucking clothes just made me incredibly happy.
Have you seen that image where it's like if everyone's uniform was like Troy's uniform? And it's all like
Yes.
low cut, like...
That originated in Star Trek shitposting.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is a hive full of treachery and villainy. It's a terrible place and a wonderful place at the same time. If I told you, the forums are not good for my mental health, but also can be amazing.
Yeah. All right, so I think we need to wrap things up there. So I want to thank everyone. So we've been joined by Sara Lynn Michener, Daniel H. Wilson, and Melinda Snodgrass. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Lovely working with all of you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Sara Lynn Michener, Daniel H. Wilson, and Melinda Snodgrass for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.